just to start, my name is Nick Fortugno. I'm a game designer and entrepreneur. I've co-founded a company called Playmatics, and I'm here today speaking in capacity for the Come Out and Play Festival, which I was a co-founder of. Come Out and Play has been around for about 12 years. I make and design games for Come Out and Play, and I also organize the festival.
I'm Youll. I'm an independent game designer. Follow me on Twitter at Cumbertop. I'm currently working on Time Bandit, which shares the politics of the physical game I made for Come Out and Play, but is a real-time game that takes place over a long period of time.
I'm Coulson. I'm also an independent game designer. I'm doing development currently on a game called Tuned Out. It's a stylish collection of arcade games brought together and this like crazy eclectic TV. Most of my work intermixes like physical games and really feeds into like the digital games I'm making and vice versa.
Hi, I'm Blake Andrews. I make a lot of, whatever stuff. And I like to screw around and make people real angry. But I helped make a Final Fantasy football with these guys.
I'm Ben Soronko. I'm working on Tuned Out with Denver. I'm also an independent game designer, and I'm super into chance mechanics.
Cool. So I'm going to speak really briefly about Come Out and Play as a whole, and then I'm going to turn it over. And each of the designers are presenting a game today, and presented it yesterday, and presented these games that Come Out and Play. So they'll speak for about 5 minutes about them, and I'll speak about a couple minutes about my own work in the field, because I think it takes a different perspective, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So maybe like 10 minutes worth of talking, and then we'll have the rest of the time for you, because we're curious to see why you're sitting in a room about live games. So this is the Come Out and Play Festival. The site you're looking at right now, this is us live. This is comeoutandplay.org. We ran our festival July 21st and 22nd of this year. We're running a few other side festivals this year, and Come Out and Play has been around for about 12 years. So Come Out and Play was co-founded by myself and Greg Trefry, Mattia Romeo, Catherine Herdlick, and Peter Lee. About 12 years ago, as a way, really Greg Trefry, who was coming out of ITP at that time, really wanted to create a space for people to make these games and see these games, because the problem was that you would do a game in public, it was like a big stunt game, and no one would play it. No one would see it, right? Because it happened once. It was really transient. So Greg had this idea, if we brought a bunch of people together, could you create an audience for these games and have designers meet each other and start to collaborate and design new games? And I had a similar idea at the time, Catherine had a similar idea at the time, and we kind of came together and formed the festival. In its current incarnation, the festival has a number of different components, but it's a lot of like games you play in public, so kind of crazy, stupid, silly games is like what we do, although you'll see that there's a lot more in the design of them than that. One aspect of it is our night game festival called After Dark, which is largely for adults, and it runs in city streets. This is an example by a game by Greg Trefry called Zombie Ward. This is it gets about 1,000 to 1,500 people when we run it, and we run it in different places. Last year we ran it in Dumbo. Then we have a field day, which is an adult field game activity that we run on Governor's Island recently. And this is all sort of like alt sports and interesting sort of games you play in parks. And then we have a family day, which is basically games designed for families, not for kids, but for families. Adults and kids play together. We don't design games specifically for kids because we feel like there's tons of them, right? We want to create interesting experiences for family and kids. And I think the thing that I'm proudest of about Come Out and Play is that, oh man, you can't see that at all. The thing I'm most proud about Come Out and Play is the fact that when we started, we were super hipster. Like we were really, really deeply hipster, and so there we go. So everybody who showed up was basically like a white person in technology between 20 and 35. And as we've gone on and on, we've gotten more economically diverse, racially diverse, culturally diverse. We just see more and more different kinds of people coming out to the festival, particularly in the family day. So we're really proud of how we've been able to broaden an audience for games for this kind of work. Now, we don't make all the games that Come Out and Play. Like Greg and I don't make everything by any stretch of the imagination. Our games come from people who create them and bring them to the festival. And so I want those designers to take some time to talk about their work and their design process, and particularly how they think about the games they make and how they make them. So we'll start with Boss Battle.
Yeah, so I made Boss Battle for the most recent festival, and it's a new Marxist role-playing sport. And just to explain what happens on the surface of the game, the workers collect balls that represent oil and pass them to each other in assembly lines to get them into a bucket, while the boss watches them and then decides how much gold to pay them after each quarter based on their performance. But that's just what happens on the surface, because everyone gets a work contract at the start, but the boss gets an addendum to the contract from the company's shareholders, while the workers get an addendum from the union. And the union is telling the workers, if they feel they're not being paid fairly for their work, to steal gold from the boss's bank account while the boss isn't looking, which he or she doesn't know about. Workers can then choose whether to pocket their gold for themselves or donate it to the union. And it's amazing to see what happens when you hand something as simple as this off to people and imply that the rules are only suggestions. Some people fill their pockets with gold. Some people steal not only from the boss, but also from the union. Some bosses start off paying their workers well and then stop paying them completely so that they'll win. Some bosses realize that they're being stolen from, and they start delegating roles to their workers, like security guard, to watch the basket that has their gold, but then the security guard starts to steal from them. Many of the games I've run have ended with the workers going on strike, even though striking isn't mentioned in the rules at all. And in the last round that I ran at Come Out and Play, the workers tried to negotiate with the boss the entire game, and then they waited out the timers in the last 2 rounds in an actual sit-down strike, and then it got a little bit violent and they mugged the boss. So people kind of bring to an experience like this the ideas that they already have about work and politics, and it ends up being a forum for acting out and even learning radical politics. But I did definitely rig it in the workers' favor. The most the boss can do is tell a worker that they're fired, but then the worker is likely to interpret that as not being paid fairly for their work, and then they can steal from the boss, and the most that the boss can do if they catch them stealing is fire them, which is just an infinite circle. But while I was designing the game, I embraced this so-called design hole as simply the rhetoric of the game. And along with that, I embraced all of the looseness and ambiguity of the rules. And writing the work contracts to give to the players was inspired by the experience I had with another New York City area game designer's game, Sean Alexander Allen's Corporate Vandals, which is a game where you're a graffiti artist and you tag boards representing city blocks and buildings with sticker graffiti. You get brief rule sheets that explain what you can do in your role, but the extent of your abilities is very ambiguous. And I played a couple of rounds of that game where players started physically blocking the boards, tearing them off of the wall, and stomping on graffiti stickers that landed on the floor. And I think a lot about how this is something that physical or social games and theater are especially good at, because the rules are socially constructed and simply agreed upon and can always be broken. Compared with digital games where a lot of the rhetoric and politics is already set down as laws in the code. Laws not in the sense of legal laws, which are more like rules, but laws of nature, which can't be broken. So the possibilities are often a lot more rigid, which is part of what I think makes fatalistic kinds of narratives that give players only an illusion of choice so popular. You know, the ones with the trope of the twist ending where you find out you were being manipulated all along, like in some well-loved arty single-player AAA games like BioShock or Metal Gear Solid, Portal, even Echo and Shadow of the Colossus all have something like that. And I think the form of computer code itself makes it well-suited for exploring fatalistic narratives, which is why that's what I do in my digital games, like Time Bandit, where the player is a worker who has to use a forklift to set boxes in motion. And I use code to make players wait a half hour in real time for the box to finish moving, and there's nothing that they can do about it. But the form of physical and social games and theater is different and better suited for exploring how players can break the rules given to them and make their own rules and even realize how their reality outside the game is equally constructed. And I think this kind of art can give people the opportunity to explore how they can change the world around them, which is an idea that I'm essentially plagiarizing from the playwright Bertolt Brecht, but I think it's important to share, especially with designers. And one last thing, game developers need unions, and there needs to be a way for more arts funding so more people have the opportunity to make games totally unconstrained by the demands of commercial markets and other interests. In the spirit of the game design.
Oh, hey, yeah. So we made Final Fantasy Football, and essentially it just started, unlike Joel's game, and God bless him for making such a like a complex sort of game that's so simple. But we were just like, Ben came to me and he was just like, oh, I just want to make a game called Final Fantasy Football, and we just based it off of the like pretty stupid pun. And we just like continued with that. We were just like, oh, what's like a combination of Final Fantasy and football? And it actually kind of took us a minute to get to this design. We started out like, you know, like, I don't know if you've played like the old NES like Final Fantasies where it's like, you know, like monsters on one side, people on one side, and it was essentially just like 3-on-3 people throwing balls at each other. But that, and we had like actual like touchdown stations. But that was really chaotic, and I was like, oh, what if it's more like Final Fantasy Tactics or something? So it's a kind of like a turn-based game where it's like you throw dice at each other. So it's kind of like a mix of like dodgeball, Dungeons and Dragons, and in the like the street game Ninja.
Yeah, like a big part of the origin also is that a few years back, Denver and I were talking about the idea of making a game that involved using a big like ball that was essentially a dice, because we kind of figured out that there's this kind of special pleasure involved with like watching it roll and like seeing what's it going to land on. And so in this game, you have a bunch of different dice that have like different probabilities, and like some of them, like you'll throw it and it'll bounce off of somebody, and you come up with no damage, and it's a real dramatic moment.
Yeah, so a lot of our work as a team, like on our individual work and together, has been like kind of recontextualizing sometimes different objects, different materials to find what is the playful nature in them. Most of that's already been done in a lot of things, whereas a ball, like most people have already figured out what you can do with a ball and what's fun about that. But like in the past, like the first time we were at Come Out and Play, we showed a game called Rainbow Disco, which plays on a record player, where instead you're playing this like Jenga-like game on top of a record player, and then like Blake has also like recontextualized stuff with the keyboard using like peanut butter on it to like create a new sense of play that it's experimental, it's sometimes weird what we're doing, but it's exploratory in nature, which can feed really well into just what you're doing in video games, because video games by their nature are usually very strange and archaic if you actually think about the real world context. But you can use that to feed back and forth with your design. Like with this particular game, it came more inspired from the video game like way of thinking of things, with Final Fantasy being where it came from. But that can also feed in vice versa, where like you want to talk a bit about your game date night?
Oh yeah, so I made a game for my thesis project at NYU that's like essentially like you're a skateboarding dog that's like throwing like you're killing police with their own bullets and stuff, but you play it with like a Guitar Hero controller, because I was like, oh, I want to just make this like as difficult and uncomfortable for people as possible. But it's like you're not going to get like the same sort of you know, tactile sensation with just like a regular controller. It's going to be like kind of a similar tactile sensation as you get from, you know, most other games. And I'm like really inspired by like Katamari Damacy, because that, you know, completely like, you know, made me like rethink like what the controller is, because it's so like one-to-one.
And then with Ben and I's thesis with what was previously called Shallow Games, now Tuned Out, it's a lot of action arcade games. The heavy thing that we've been trying to intermix is thinking of these almost as like, what are the live action games of these, and what is the chance? What is the aspect that digital games bring in that can enhance the play space to make it like inherently a video game? So like finding out where those intersections and key differences are, I found very rewarding during our design.
And it's like, just to like kind of summarize that, I think JRPGs are maybe one of the most janky, kind of weird, contrived genres, and to put that into a space like a physicality where you have complete freedom of motion, like to kind of form those rules onto that is kind of just a fun experiment, and I think that's what's kind of interesting about this interplay between physical and digital.
Yeah, on that note, I think it's such a fascinating thing. How many of you are familiar with Killer Queen Arcade? Did you know that was a street game first? Yeah, ran it Come Out and Play the first time. It was game of the year it ran, and it was Josh Devonis and Nick Mikros trying to think of how to make an RTS a physical game, right? And how do you have like a resource gathering game that could be physical and involve like all the stuff you do when you gather pollen with like running and grabbing balls out of buckets, and then you had these foam swords that you would attack with the knight, and it was brilliant. And they were like, this game's too good, we have to do something with it, and that was effectively where Killer Queen came from. So it was a super interesting intersection, and I think it's useful to hear about like these different kinds of directions, because this is the kind of stuff you see in Come Out and Play. Our games are kind of stupid and silly, like in terms of the play. They're always kind of dumb. That's like part of the point, is that they're supposed to be silly, but they're often fueled by like really deep kinds of political thinking, or really deep kinds of aesthetic thinking, or really deep, like formalist constraint thinking about like how do we build these kind of mechanics. So to look at it from an aesthetic perspective, I just want to very quickly talk about a game I designed called Kill 'em and You'll Be Famous, which came about basically because we run a big game at the end of Come Out and Play that runs for like 20 or 30 people at a time, and we try to like show something off. And I picked it one year, and I was really bored with like games that were either every person for themselves or team-based. That's what you always do when you have a lot of people. And so I tried to think of another model. And the model I came up with was one versus many. I was thinking like Mario Party, and like, oh, you have these like 3 against 1 games. So those are really interesting. So what if you had like a 1 against 15 game? What would that look like? And I was consulting in China at the time, so my head just sort of went around China, and I realized that in every kung fu movie, there's a scene that's like 1 against 15. It's when the martial art master takes on the thugs, right? Like Jet Li falls into a dojo, and then there's like a bunch of thugs who jump up and try to fight him. And it's a pattern that everyone knows. If you've ever seen a kung fu movie, you know the scene I'm talking about. So I decided to make a game about that, and so I basically did a bunch of testing to figure out how to emulate martial arts. And the safe example I came up with was the idea of having the master wear a backpack. In this case, the backpack is a trash bin that I drilled holes into and strapped to somebody's body. That's Greg Truck Ride, by the way. Just to show you we are not above embarrassing ourselves for our art. And then the attackers try to throw a ball into the master's backpack. And the reason why I did that is because it creates this interaction where the attacker is throwing their arms at the other person in a way that comes toward their head, but the attacker has no incentive to actually hit the person. So you get this thing that sort of looks like someone's trying to punch them, but it's safe. And I've run this game for hundreds of people, and the worst injury I got was someone twisted their ankle while they were running around in a wet field. So like I've never had anyone punch anyone like in this game, because it's designed not to do that. And then the aesthetics of the game sort of came out of that. So this is me running the game at Come Out and Play for way too many people. But it involved a patter where I would tell them about Twin Spear Phoenix Kung Fu and how grandmasters of Twin Spear Phoenix Kung Fu haven't been seen in hundreds of years. And then I nominate a master, and then they play this game where they run around in a circle like fencers trying to kill a master. The goal of the game is that the master has to kill all of the attackers in the circle. And the attackers try to kill the master. And if an attacker kills the master, that attacker becomes the master, and then the game repeats for that master. And where that master has to kill all of the attackers. And we just play the game for 20 minutes until someone defeats every attacker in the game, which has never happened, or until 20 minutes are up and the person with the most points for killing or escaping attackers win. And what was fascinating about this, like sort of speaking to the looseness of rules that you were talking about, is that I saw enormous numbers of expressions of movement through the attackers. They actually created different styles. So this is Alex Goldmark, who's a producer for Planet Money. Again, we are shameless at Come Out and Play. Jumping, right? Like he'd use this jumping attack. Sam Roberts, who works with Indiecade, would use this like rapid circle feint attack. So you actually saw people emulate different martial arts styles in the game. That's really what I wanted, was this moment where as an attacker, you felt like you could express yourself as a martial artist, and as a master, you had that experience of being surrounded by people. So I think that's a good place to stop for questions, because I think like it's nice to see like the reason why I think this panel makes sense is that we're seeing 3 very different perspectives on game design here. Like one which is very motivated by a sort of like a kind of a polemic argument, and designed to teach that argument through gameplay, but through something that can be large and expressive and loose. kinds of game design that come out of constraints and thinking about like possibilities of constraint and interface and like what that means when you really look at it from the perspective of almost pure game design and build out from that. And notice, by the way, for those of you who will attack formalism, that none of that was minus aesthetic, right? This is always thinking about the aesthetic, but it's thinking about it from this highly formal perspective. And then in the case of this game that I'm showing that I worked on, something that was really born out of just a desire to reproduce a narrative in a particular way. So I hope that was interesting. We are running Come Out and Play games right now, so we're going to leave here and go back up to the roof if you want to see not this game, but the other two games, and a game by Greg Treffry called Game of Foams, where you kill your friends with foam swords in action. But that's basically it. We have about 5 minutes for any questions anybody has. If not, I will ask designers questions. Yeah. The year before. We're 12 years old now. I'd be curious to hear, like, from all of you, what you've seen at the festival in the time that you've been there. Do you have any responses to that first?
I've only been to I think I've been to the last 4. And the last 2 I was showing games, so I didn't. But,
Well, I think it's. I mean, I've been a couple of times, but I started submitting games. Me and Joel have had 2 games that both me and him have worked on, and they're really like the games me and him have worked on are like the most anti-formalist, like crazy weird. Like both of them were wearing masks and like making people do like weird things, and there aren't like a whole lot of rules to it.
Grave Choices had a lot of formal systems.
Well, I'm more talking about the game that we might
The more
not
recent
have.
one, no, there's not really much.
There's a
much
secret game
systems
we
to it.
worked on.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that's happened is that, like, what Greg wanted to have happen has happened, is that people are in conversation with each other. So you can hear when they're talking about their games, you hear these precedents coming up. That did not happen when Come Out and Play started, because there weren't many, right? And I remember teaching a class where I was talking about how I had worked with, like, Jane McGonigal and Frank Lance, and like the students were getting us sort of wide-eyed, and I was like, this is not meant to be impressive. It's not like I know all the people in big games. It's that there are 10 people in big games, right? It's like we just know each other because we're the only people doing this, and so there weren't a lot of this kind of thing. But the idea that you could have a conversation where you were sort of talking about Ninja or talking about a graffiti game you saw at another festival or something like that, like that's a big change, and it means that the games have gotten kind of more sophisticated overall. Like people running games are now sort of thinking about games, and there have been enough models of games that explore political and aesthetic things in really interesting ways that I think it's a freer space to do that kind of work. So like Greg Treffry's work, for example, which is really, I mean, he's a brilliant game designer, his work is stunning, is often about like history stuff he's interested in. So Charge of the Rubber Ball Brigade, which is a game of dodgeball you play with like 60 dodgeballs and like 80 people, is an emulation of Pickett's Charge from the Civil War. And I know that sounds really bizarre, and it's a stupid game, right? In terms of like you throw dodgeballs at people. It's not like something like really highfalutin. But when you play it, you get this experience of what a charge into like a hopeless charge into enemy fire looks like, right? And so like emulations like that are something that I think we've cultivated in a really strong way. Yes. At Come Out and Play, we always show new games because that's our intent. We do a game, like good games feature in multiple places, and other festivals like sister festivals of ours, like City of Play, or when Come Out and Play goes to other cities like San Francisco, or we may be going to Toronto soon. We tend to like farm the games out there, and there are some classic games that are very good that you can still play today. One example is a game called Circle Rules Football, which was created at the one of the very first Come Out and Plays. I think the second one was when Circle Rules Football came into existence, and that's still played all around the country. It's a variation of soccer that plays with an arc net in the center of the field that both players fight for. Johann Sebastian Joust showed for the first time at Come Out and Play. So that game has circulated some. You might have heard of that. not that we take any credit for this. Killer Queen exists because of Come Out and Play in a roundabout way. Again, not our credit. Like when I say things like that, I'm not trying to take any credit for them. We just gave them a forum to show off their work. But that was really cool, and there are designers here, some of whom are sitting in the audience, who have showcased work in Come Out and Play, and you could talk to them about like what that was like. I think that it's hard for some of these games to continue to sustain because they require a lot of people present, and we don't make any money Come Out and Play for anything we do, because we just do it because we want this thing to exist. So we're trying to figure out ways to sort of like create a record of what we've done, so that designers like this, their work can kind of like live on beyond the transience of the festival, and that's something that I'm actively going to start working on this year. You know, like putting together some documentation around this. There's also a couple of resources you can find. Hide and Seek did some work cataloging some of the games that they ran, which is a sister festival that ran in the UK. And a few different groups have their games like put together in an interesting way. So Adam Nelson at City of Play out of Pittsburgh, Simon Johnson out of Bristol has a lot of games that have been like recorded, and you can find them. And then some of my games, all of my games are available Creative Commons, attribution, share alike, non-commercial. So I'm happy to send you the rules for anything I've ever made, and you can go make it yourself. Kill 'Em and You'll Be Famous costs $50 to make.
Yeah, another thing to mention is a lot of these games are very much in the cross-section of folk games, where people just naturally, like one of the games we ran runs with jump ropes, and like people have just been like, hey, like, can you send me the rules? I'll just email to them, and then they'll just play it wherever they are, because I don't need to be there to run it. Even same with the record player game like we made. I would guess that kids made a version of it most likely back in like the 60s and 70s, and if anything, we just rediscovered it and brought it out into the open. So like, I don't know, I find game design very often to be something that's found and shared from there and just rediscovered, and kind of the more repurposed and finding the truer version would be what's kind of fun about it all.
Any last questions? Great. Well, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your Play NYC, and feel free to stop by the roof and check out the Come Out and Play games that are there, including these great designers' games.